Hey everyone, this is Lorraine Driscoll, founder of Building Better Brains, and today I want to talk about the link between a history of ear infections, and it doesn't have to be several, it can even be as simple as one ear infection, and reading difficulties. And I say reading difficulties, but this can also apply to auditory processing disorder, ADHD as well. So listen up if this is something that your child has experienced. If you're kind of like banging your head against a wall because you've been working on phonemic awareness and doing all those, literacy building skills, and maybe even in tutoring and remedial reading programs, this could be the reason why your child is actually not getting the results that you're hoping for. And it could actually boil down to something structural that could be healed. And this has to do with the tiny hairs called the cilia inside the ear, as well as the auditory nerve. And if you are doing phonics drills and these literacy building skills and so forth, but there's something not quite right or not working optimally with the structures of the ear or just the hearing process, then your attempts are going to be futile, and it's going to leave you and your child so frustrated and discouraged, and there's no need for that. So I know a lot of parents will say, well, we've had my child's hearing tested and their hearing is fine. So that could be the case. Sometimes the hearing or the cilia is damaged just enough to, like, they can hear fine, but they're not detecting or distinguishing the difference between certain sounds, for example, like ba and da. That's really common with dyslexia, as well as other features with phonemic awareness and even auditory processing, which is huge when it comes to learning disabilities, as well as even behavior issues. So in the parents' pediatric report, what was found is that kids who had ear infections had a significant impact on language development. In fact, it found that 1/3 of children, basically 1/3 of children who had hearing issues had difficulty with phonological awareness. So 1 in 3 is pretty huge if you ask me, in terms of if we're not looking at that factor and how certain structures of the ear could be compromised, and we're trying to do all of this practice, but we're not fixing the root cause. No wonder some of these kids just can never get ahead. So this can result, depending on the severity, in mild hearing loss or damage that impacts phoneme detection and so forth. Study led by Dr. Winskell at the University of Western Sydney found that the peak incidence, if you will, of ear infections tended to happen during a critical period of language development, which was typically around 6 to 18 months. So let me know in the comments, has your child had a history of ear infections? It could have just been one. It doesn't have to be a whole bunch, but some I know have had multiple, and they tell me that. And so what the study found is that when a child is learning speech sounds and fine-tuning their phonological awareness is between this critical time period, and if they have ear infections during this critical time period, that caused some amount of damage, and it could be slightly, it could be pretty minor, but when it comes to distinguishing and developing phonemic awareness and distinguishing sounds, that can have quite the impact. Basically, what Dr. Winskell found in his study is that this can have long-term effects on language and literacy skills. So if there was a history of ear infections, what was found is that there was lower scores on the phonological awareness and expressive language testing. So pretty significant, results in terms of what happens and so forth whenever these kids have these ear infections that can cause damage. And actually, in a 1997 study, yes, this is going far back, but still relevant nonetheless, what they found is that 90% of kids with ADHD had a history of 3 or more ear infections. And I can tell you that I see this quite a bit in clinic with clients and so forth, where yes, they have had a history of ear infections among other infections and so forth. So what was found at the University of Colorado with reference to ADHD and dyslexia are 2 things. and super interesting. I love it because it kind of goes deep into it's never just one thing, and there's a lot of layers to this. So number one, obviously ear infection can cause damage, but number one, when kids get ear infections, they take antibiotics, which we're not going to debate if antibiotics are good or bad because they're neither. They have, they can be life-saving 100%, but they definitely come with, some repercussions, if you will. And so when kids take these antibiotics to address the ear infection, it will damage and alter the gut microbiome. And if you've been following me for a while, you know that the microbiome is critical in creating certain neurotransmitters, right? These gut bacteria, some of these neurotransmitters are manufactured exclusively or almost entirely by the different bacteria in the gut. So if this is compromised, that's going to affect neurotransmitter production, which is connected to learning disabilities, ADHD, and more specifically, like certain gut bacteria that produces certain neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, GABA, and so forth have a huge impact in sensory regulation, in focus, memory, mood, all of that type of stuff that we need our kids to be able to do in order to perform well in school and in life. The other factor with antibiotics, which you might probably be aware of, is that there's a real big connection with yeast overgrowth or the overgrowth of candida. And when kids have this yeast overgrowth, yeast can cause issues with focus, with memory, foggy thinking. A lot of the kids that I work with who have yeast issues also have, can be really silly and hyperactive, laughing at inappropriate times or just giggly. Sensory processing issues, anger issues, and even slower processing speed. So you see how this is so not just like damage to the cilia or, the auditory nerve is affected and so forth. Number two thing that University of Colorado found is that, yes, the infection and inflammation from the ear infection will obviously damage the cilia that transmits sound accurately. So this is going to compromise everything from language acquisition, so speech issues, for example, phonological awareness, and even auditory processing. So auditory processing is huge. Auditory processing disorder, I should say, is huge in connection with learning difficulties, behavior, attention difficulties, all of that type of things. And, it's really sad because when kids have these difficulties, too often our immediate go-to is medication, IEPs, tutoring, when the real problem is auditory, or could be, that's definitely not the only factor, but one of the very real factors could be auditory processing disorder connected to the being caused by these ear infections. So in a nutshell, auditory processing, I've talked about a lot before. If you've never heard of it, I'm going to narrow it down into a nutshell. It basically will affect reading, speech, following instructions, being able to pay attention, being able to sequence. These are the kids where you say, I need you to do X, Y, Z, or A, B, C, D, E, and they come back and they've done A and they're like, what? You want me to do other stuff? Among other things. So really, really important. So all this to say, no need to panic. We can totally heal most or all of the damage that can be caused by ear infections, whether it's from the antibiotics or the actual damage to the cilia and so forth. So one thing I want to say is, first of all, I always like to say, I don't advise supplementing alone. I do like to use caution with supplements, especially when it comes to children, but really important to consider if your child's diet has sufficient vitamin A, because vitamin A is most abundant in the cilia of the ear, and in studies is actually found to improve speech significantly. Number two, things like omega-3s, as well as certain key minerals that I'm not going to mention because it depends on the child, and I feel like it can get kind of messy and so forth. But basically, after 4 months of a targeted protocol specific to a child's bio-individual needs, what was found is that the information processing improved significantly. So, of course, there are many causes. As I always say, it's never just one. There's many causes to dyslexia, reading difficulties, attention, focus, behavior, all that type of stuff. But when we start looking at all of those layers, that's when we can really get some answers that can finally bring us to the real solution. So if you want to learn more about root causes in terms of how it's specifically affecting your child, to start uncovering what are the factors, I will be hosting a training on Saturday, April 9th, called Identifying the Root Causes and Their Solutions. So this is currently on promo for $37. Typically it's regular priced $47 as of April 3rd. So you can either DM me to save the spot. I will put the link for that in the comments below. But grab your spot, because sometimes spots fill up. We've had that a few times where we've run out of space. And my goal is to make this a really interactive training, not just to talk at you, but to make it interactive so that we can start uncovering specifically what are some potential causes to your child, specifically in terms of what's going on with them and other moms and so forth. So I'm all about, let's make this interactive and individualized, not just here's some information that I'm going to throw at you, have fun. So have a great day, everyone, and take care.